In the 16th century, being born a princess did not mean being born protected. It did not mean being born privileged in the way we understand privilege today. It meant being born useful. For noble daughters, life was not built around choice, identity, or personal future. It was built around strategy, marriage treaties, political alliances, diplomatic leverage, bloodlines, borders. Your body was diplomacy. Your fertility was policy. Your marriage was foreign policy. Your life was never truly your own. You were not raised as a person. You were raised as a function. And nowhere is this more visible than inside the Medici dynasty of Florence. The Medici are remembered as builders of Renaissance Europe, bankers, patrons of art, architects of political power, creators of stability, founders of dynasties, protectors of culture. But that story is almost always told through men: Cosimo, Lorenzo, popes, cardinals, generals, rulers. When history speaks of Medici power, it speaks in male names. But when you follow the women, a completely different story appears. A quiet story, a slow story, a story without monuments, without glory, without victory. A story of daughters born into wealth, but not into safety. Born into palaces, but not into protection. Born into power, but not into agency. Cosimo I de' Medici, Duke of Florence and later Grand Duke of Tuscany, created one of the strongest centralized states in Renaissance Italy. His rule was disciplined, strategic, organized, and politically successful. Florence under Cosimo became stable, efficient, and powerful. But inside his own household, stability did not exist in the emotional sense. His family was not a sanctuary. It was a political structure. His children were not raised as children. They were raised as assets. Cosimo and his wife, Eleonora of Toledo, had 11 children, 7 sons, 4 daughters. And almost none of the daughters lived full lives. Not because of accidents, not because of coincidence, but because their lives were shaped by a system that did not protect them, prepare them, or value them beyond their function. And this is only the beginning. If you enjoy thoughtful history, stay with this channel and subscribe. The first was Bia de' Medici, Cosimo's illegitimate daughter, born before his marriage. Her mother's identity is lost to history. No name, no record, no story, just absence. But Cosimo acknowledged Bia publicly. He raised her in his household. He loved her openly. Contemporary sources describe her as affectionate, joyful, gentle, emotionally warm. She was not hidden. She was not erased. She was not treated as a shame. She was his favorite child. In Renaissance Italy, illegitimacy often meant exclusion. But Bia was an exception, not because the system was kind, but because Cosimo was powerful enough to ignore its rules. He kept her close. He protected her. He treated her as his own in every sense that mattered. And then she died at 6 years old, most likely from malaria, a common killer in 16th century Italy. No conspiracy, no drama, no intrigue, just disease. Cosimo was devastated. He commissioned a posthumous portrait of her, not as a dynastic symbol, not as propaganda, not as political messaging, but as remembrance. A grieving father preserving the image of a child he loved. In that portrait, Bia is not shown as a Medici instrument. She is shown as a child, calm, innocent, present, human. It is one of the rare moments where Renaissance power intersects with private grief, and then she disappears from history, not because she mattered less, but because childhood death was normalized. Anna de' Medici, born later to Eleonora, lived only a few months. Her life left almost no historical trace. No portrait, no records, no letters, no memory. In the 16th century, infant mortality was so common that even royal children vanished without narrative. She became another silent absence, another erased existence, another human life reduced to a line in a family record. Maria de' Medici was Cosimo and Eleonora's first legitimate daughter. From childhood, her future was already written. Not in words, in expectations. She was educated carefully, taught languages, manners, religion, court behavior, but never selfhood, never autonomy, never independence. From the moment she could walk, her value was political. Her childhood was preparation for marriage. Her education was preparation for alliance. Her identity was preparation for diplomacy. Her portraits were sent to foreign courts when she was still a child, not as art, but as proposals. Political negotiations wrapped in paint. Her face became a document. Her image became a contract. Her existence became currency. She was being prepared for marriage long before she reached adulthood. She died at 17, most likely from malaria. Later rumors tried to turn her death into scandal, poison, intrigue, political murder, but historical evidence supports illness, not violence. Her death was not dramatic. It was quiet, sudden, biological. And once she died, her political role did not disappear. It simply transferred. The alliance she was meant to create was reassigned to her younger sister. Her value moved. Her place was replaced. The system continued unchanged. Lucrezia de' Medici was born into that replacement role. She did not inherit a childhood. She inherited a function. At 13, she was married to Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duke of Ferrara. This was not romance, not union, not choice. It was a treaty, a contract, a strategic alliance between two ruling houses. Her wedding was not a celebration. It was a transaction. After the marriage, she was left behind while her husband returned to court. When she later joined him, she was already physically fragile. Historical records describe recurring illness, fevers, weakness, respiratory symptoms. Modern historians identify pulmonary tuberculosis as the most likely cause. No poisoning, no conspiracy, no court drama, just disease in a child body under adult pressure. She died at 16, a duchess in title, a child in reality. Her marriage never became a life, her role never became an identity, her future never became real. She existed only long enough to fulfill a political contract. And then there was Isabella de' Medici. Isabella lived longer, and because she lived longer, she suffered more. She was intelligent, educated, charismatic, socially skilled, emotionally complex. She was not passive. She was not silent. She was not invisible. She was married into the powerful Orsini family, a political alliance between two elite houses. Her marriage was cold, controlled, and unstable, not built on partnership, but on ownership. She endured miscarriages, emotional isolation, surveillance, control. A husband who treated her not as a person, but as property. She formed a long-term relationship outside her marriage, not as scandal, not as rebellion, but as survival. Emotional survival inside a structure that gave her no space to exist as a human being. In 1576, Isabella was strangled to death by her husband, with the silent approval of her own family. Not through law, not through court, not through trial, through power, through honor culture, through dynastic image control. Her death was not a crime in the political logic of the time. It was a correction, a removal of inconvenience, a restoration of control. She was not executed by the state. She was erased by the system. These girls were not weak. They were not naive. They were not careless. They were not foolish. They were not ignorant. They were born into a system that did not protect women, even when those women were noble, wealthy, educated, and powerful by name. They were valuable only while useful and disposable when inconvenient. They lived in palaces, but they did not live in safety. They wore silk, but had no autonomy. They carried titles, but had no control. They were called princesses, but had no sovereignty over their own lives. History remembers the Medici as builders, rulers, patrons of art, architects of Renaissance civilization. But history often forgets their daughters, not because they were unimportant, but because their lives were never meant to matter beyond alliance and function. Yet they existed. They laughed. They learned. They feared. They hoped. They loved. They suffered. They were not symbols. They were not pawns. They were not abstractions. They were human beings, and they deserved more than silence. To understand the fate of the Medici daughters, you have to understand the system they were born into. Renaissance dynasties were not families in the modern sense. They were political organisms. Their purpose was not emotional connection. Their purpose was continuity of power, stability of territory, control of alliances, preservation of bloodlines, expansion of influence. Everything inside the dynasty served that structure, including children. Sons were raised as successors. Daughters were raised as instruments. A daughter's body was not her own. It belonged to the dynasty. Her fertility was not private, it was political. Her marriage was not personal, it was diplomatic. Her obedience was not virtue, it was necessity. Her silence was not grace, it was survival. Education for noble daughters was carefully limited. They were taught religion, manners, modesty, obedience, household management, court behavior, languages, but never leadership, never governance, never independence, never power. They were prepared to fit into another household, another dynasty, another political structure. They were not raised to belong to themselves. Marriage was not a transition, it was a transfer of ownership, from father to husband, from one house to another, from one political structure to the next. And once transferred, protection depended entirely on usefulness. A woman who produced heirs had value. A woman who did not was a liability. A woman who obeyed was tolerated. A woman who resisted was dangerous. A woman who caused scandal was disposable. Cosimo valued his daughters and still treated them as political currency. Families mourned, but still replaced them in alliance negotiations. Grief existed, but power continued. Because the system did not stop for loss, it absorbed it. The Medici daughters were not exceptions. They were the rule. Their lives were not tragic because they were unique. They were tragic because they were normal for elite women of their time. The only difference is that the Medici were powerful enough to leave records, portraits, contracts, documents, archives. Thousands of unnamed noble daughters across Europe lived the same lives and disappeared without names. What makes the Medici story visible is not cruelty, it is documentation. This is not a story about evil individuals, systems, institutions, power logic, dynastic mathematics, political survival, where human lives were variables and women were units of exchange. These girls did not fail their roles. The roles failed them. They were not broken. The system was. They were not fragile. The structure was violent. They were not powerless by nature. They were stripped of power by design. They were born into a world where safety did not belong to women, even when those women were born into palaces. And this is the truth behind Renaissance grandeur. Art flourished, architecture rose, culture expanded, power centralized, states stabilized. But human cost was constant. Beauty coexisted with brutality. Culture coexisted with control. Art coexisted with silence. Civilization coexisted with disposability. This is not just a Medici story. This is a dynasty story. This is a monarchy story. This is a European elite story. This is a power story. And it repeats across centuries. Because systems change slower than faces. Because structures survive longer than people. Because power always needs bodies. History remembers empires, but rarely remembers what they cost. Thank you for watching. If you value history told carefully and accurately, consider staying with this channel and subscribing. The past deserves precision as much as curiosity.